Hey guys, Shane Zell here. You guys seem to like my last tier list so much, so I decided to do another one. This tier list is going to be based on the weapons power for casual play in Final Fantasy 1 for the NES. We're going to start off with the very first weapons you can buy in the first town, the wooden nunchuck. I'm putting it here in the D tier. It's only useful if you have a black belt, because it's the only weapon that it can use that deals any damage, and it's useful for black belts from levels 1 through 5-ish. After that, you pretty much want to take it off. So it's not very useful. D tier is just niche, you mostly don't want it. Our next weapon is the small knife. Small knife I put into the C tier. It's pretty bad. It's one of the strongest weapons for the black belt. Sorry, not the black belt, the black mage in the early levels of the game, just so he has a weapon that he can hit enemies with for single digit damage. It's just some sort of poke damage for when he is out of spells. And if you're just playing through casually, you'll probably be out of spells a lot. Next up, we've got the wooden staff. Pretty much F tier weapon. You should never be buying this under normal circumstances. In certain speed runs, I buy it to give my black mage a slightly higher chance to crit at the cost of 10 hit percentage, but for the most part, it's generally considered to be a much worse weapon than the small knife for everyone that can use it, which is every class except for the thief. Next up, we've got our first actual decent weapon, the rapier. Rapier goes in the B tier as your strongest weapon for fighters, thieves, and red mages for up until you get to the next town of Provoka. So the first town up for killing Garland, it's your best weapon you'll have access to. Next up, we've got the Iron Hammer. I'm also putting it in C tier just because it's the best weapon that the White Mage can use. The White Mage can use either the hammer or the staff, and the hammer is just way better. It has the same power as the rapier, but no accuracy bonus. But as a white mage, you'll be using that thing for a long time. Our next weapons that we use are when we get to the town of Provoka. You can buy 3 new weapons there. The first of them being the short sword, which I will put here in B tier. The short sword is got 5 more attack power than the rapier and 5 more accuracy, but it's only usable by the red mage and the fighter. Once the fighter hits level 5, he gets 2 swings with that thing, and you'll really see its power coming out. Next up, we've got the hand axe. It could go back and forth a little bit for the hand axe, but I'm going to put it in C tier. It's technically stronger than the short sword and has a higher critical hit rate. Only usable by the fighter, same cost as the short sword. Technically, when you're level 4 and under, it's a better weapon than the short sword for the fighter. And again, it's better than the short sword once you hit level 7. But for level 5 and 6, you'll get 2 swings sooner by using the short sword. So most people would prefer to use the short sword. And it's usable by the red mage, which just makes it better. Next up, we've got the scimitar, a cheap option. 200 gold instead of the 550 for the other 2 weapons, and it's also usable by the thief. Technically, once you hit Provoka, it's your strongest weapon for the thief, and your second strongest weapon for the red mage, possibly third-ish. Yeah, it's the third strongest for the fighter, but you generally don't want to buy too many unless you're just in need of weapons for just something you can afford. It's only 1 more attack power than the rapier. A lot of times you can hold off until you can just afford the 550. Next up, we've got the Elfland weapons. So the first one up is the Iron Nunchuck. Again, it's just going in the D tier, only usable by the black belts. And it's also not used super long, which is why it's not in a higher tier like the knife and the hammer. because the nunchucks, again, by the time you get to Elfland, you'll only be using them for a few levels. You'll be able to just throw them away by the time you hit level, depending on what you fight, generally around level 8. You can theoretically take them off earlier if you'd like, if you're fighting no defense enemies like sharks and wolves a bunch. But if you end up fighting like ogres or something like that that has more absorption, iguanas, then you're going to want the extra damage of the iron chucks until at least you hit level 8-ish. But then after that, you just throw them away and your black belt's better off barehanded. Then we've got the large knife. I'm also going to put it here in the C tier. It's pretty much the same thing as the small knife, just a tiny bit more attack power, more critical hit rate. But it's the best weapon your black mage can use for a while here. Then the next weapon we've got is the iron staff. You pretty much never want to use this weapon. It is worse than all the weapons that the fighter can use. It's worse than the weapon that the black belt can use. There's only one niche situation when I pick it up in speedrunning, because it's a cheap weapon with decent crit rate and acceptable power, but it's never your best choice of a weapon. Moving on, we've got the saber. Not a great weapon. I'll put it in the C tier as well. It is your best weapon for the thief once you get up to Elfland. It has more attack power than the scimitar, but less accuracy. If you're doing like a solo thief run, or 4 thief runs, you'll be using sabers until you hit level 10. And at level 10, you'd switch to the scimitars until you hit 12. But we're just talking about more casual stuff than weird challenge runs. Next weapon is our first amazing weapon, and this is the silver sword. I'm going to put this thing up into the A tier. You could go as much and say it's an S tier weapon. You know what? I'll put it into the S tier, just because I know if I don't, I'm going to get a lot of hate. The silver sword is pretty amazing. It is a very powerful weapon. You should not be able to buy it as early as Elfland. But if you do buy it by the time you make it to Elfland, your fighters and red mages can deal absurd damage very early on. And it can last you for a long time. You can buy it before you go to the Marsh Cave, and it can be your best weapon for Marsh Cave, then for Astos, then going into the Earth Cave. Then it can stay an acceptable weapon into the mid-game even. So it's not bad at all. So I was going to originally put it into A, but I think we'll go up to S, just because it really is that good. So next are some weapons that you can't purchase immediately, but they're the next weapons you get access to. Once you go through Marsh Cave and you end up with a key at some point, you will get access to the Silver Hammer, which I'll also put in the C tier because it is your white mage's best weapon for a good portion of the game, or at least tied for your best weapon for the white mage. It is a slight increase in attack power and accuracy over the iron hammer, and it's what your white mage is going to use for a long time. Next up, we've got the falchion. The falchion isn't a great weapon. I'm putting it here into the D tier. Technically, it could be one of your best weapons, if not your best weapon, for a thief. It is the same attack power as the short sword, same accuracy as the short sword, with a heightened critical hit rate. But you get it much later, and by the time you get access to the falchion, you get access to a lot of other weapons that are generally better. Then we've got the iron staff. Or not the iron staff, sorry. The power staff. The power staff I will put into the C tier. It is not super powerful. It can go off and on between being your strongest weapon for your white or black mage because of its heightened critical hit rate. And also, if you don't want to use it as a weapon, you can sell it for an interesting amount of money. It's a lot of money too, by the way. Then you get access to the silver knife. The silver knife isn't an amazing weapon, but it is useful. I'm going to put it into C tier as well. That's probably the final C tier weapon. The silver knife is great for the black mage, usable technically by red mage, usable by the thief. It can be one of the thief's stronger weapons, and it can really hold your mages throughout the mid game pretty well. Then we finally start getting to the elemental weapons that you can start acquiring with the key. The first one being the rune sword. The rune sword I'm going to put up into the B tier. It actually doesn't have a very high attack power. It's only 18, slightly lower than some of the other elemental swords that you get around the same time, but it has the highest critical hit rate of the group. It ends up being arguably the best weapon for your thief for, well, the entire game is if he stays a thief until you get the Masamune. And it's also a usable weapon for your fighter or red mages. Then next up we've got the wear sword. The wear sword is like the rune sword, except it's not usable by the thief. It has the same 18 attack power with a less critical hit rate. It's never going to be your strongest weapon, and it's generally not one you'll want to be using. So I'm putting it in D tier just because the thief can't use it, and it's only the fighter and red mage that have access to way better weapons. The dragon sword I'm also going to put in D tier. It technically has one more attack power than the wear sword, and is usable by the thief, but it's your thief's third best weapon, so it's not really that great. The elemental properties don't work on the NES, so you don't get bonus damage versus giants with, or dragons with the dragon sword, or, giants with the giant sword, etc. Then we've got the longsword, which I think is going to be our final F tier weapon. You probably should never be buying this thing. By the time you get to Melmond and you can purchase this weapon, you should already have plenty of other weapons that have more accuracy with almost the same attack power with well over double the critical hit rate. You never want to buy the longsword. It's only usable by the fighter and the red mage, and they have plenty of better options. The next weapon you technically don't have to see immediately. You could put it off, but it's the silver axe. Once you have access to sailing around the world, you can sail over to Crescent Lake. You can buy more silver knives if you need them for your black mages. You can buy more silver hammers for white mages if necessary. You can buy more silver swords if you'd like to for any other red mages you had if you didn't buy them in Elfland. And you can finally buy the silver axe. The silver axe may seem weird for me to put up into the B tier, but if you're playing through the game casually and you're like around level 10 through 13ish, the silver axe is actually your best weapon you have access to at this point, technically stronger than the silver sword. It has more attack power and more critical hit rate. It has slightly less accuracy, but the accuracy doesn't really affect you that much unless it's giving you extra swings at this point. So technically, the silver axe can be your best weapon from levels, well, anything from level 7 through 13 on a fighter. But once you hit 14, the silver sword is again better because it gets an additional swing. Now, once you dive the Earth Cave, you get access to the Coral Sword. And the Coral Sword I'm also going to put up in the B tier. It's arguably the best weapon for the thief. One more attack power than the Rune Sword, but slightly less critical hit ratio. It's my favorite weapon for a thief. And I also like its pink look. I think it looks great. But it's also a good weapon for your backup fighters if you don't have silver swords, or your red mages if you don't have more silver swords. It ends up being an acceptable weapon there. Next up, once you have access to the ruby, you can get the great axe, or the not so great axe. I'm putting it in the D tier. It is probably about your fourth best weapon for a fighter by the time you get it. So if you have 4 fighters, you could theoretically use this if you didn't have a bunch of silver swords and silver axes already for your fighters. Your coral swords used up, then you could theoretically use the giant axe. Next up will be a bunch of weapons that you kind of have access to all around the same time. And if you're doing the playthrough in, I guess, a suggested order, then you could say you'd go to Volcano next, but you don't have to. The game really opens up after you get the canoe. But I'm just going to go through them in this order. We'll have up the giant sword next. The giant sword is not great. It's going into the D tier. By the time you get access to the giant sword, it's probably going to be your 4th best weapon for your fighter or red mage. It is less attack power than the silver sword, but it has higher critical hit ratio, so it could be better in specific circumstances, but generally you're not going to want to use the giant sword. You just don't. So next up we've got our first A tier weapon, the ice sword. You can get 2 of these. One in the volcano, weird, I know, and one in ordeals, both of which you can technically get before going to the ice cave. It is a very powerful endgame weapon that you have access to in 2 separate dungeons. And by the time you get it, it's probably going to be your best weapon. Not probably, it will be your best weapon for your red mage and fighters. So it's great, and you can use it all the way into the end game. It's still a very powerful weapon. Next up is the flame sword. You could throw this thing into B tier, but I'm going to put it into A tier just because it is still a usable weapon even into the end game. You get one of these once you go to the ice cave, and depending if you go into the ice cave first, it can be your strongest weapon. It's finally stronger than the silver sword. So it's same with the ice sword, but if you go to the ice cave first, flame sword will be your best weapon, and it can last you to the end game. It's great for both your fighters and red mages. You notice I'm not saying thief because the thief can't use any of the weapons now. So assuming you finally get class change, or I guess this is an ordeals weapon too. This is the heal staff. It's not the best weapon to use in combat, but it's the first weapon you can use as an item and cast the heal spell on your entire team with any character, healing 12 to 24 HP. It is extremely useful even into the end game. It's not the strongest weapon, but it's great for saving you from buying 99 heal potions anytime you go anywhere. You can always make a character that's not dealing much damage to just throw out a heal staff every round in combat and just heal up your whole party. It's amazing. So that's all the weapons you can technically pick up before you have the floater and the airship. So next, we'll go over weapons that once you've acquired the airship, you can pick up. And we've got the cat claw. I'm going to put the cat claw in... Do I put it in B tier or A tier? I'm going to put it in B just because it's insanely expensive. You could put it into A tier. It is the strongest weapon for your black wizard. Technically, as soon as you get the airship, if you have lots of money hanging around, or laying around, you could equip one on your fighter, or your knight, I should say. You could put one on your ninja, technically. You can put one on your red wizard. And there's a good chance it's going to be your strongest weapon by the time you first pick up the airship. You know what? I'll put it into A tier just because of that. It's expensive. It's 65,000 bucks, but it is a very powerful weapon that you can purchase as soon as you have the airship. Now, it looks kind of lame. It looks exactly like the silver sword or the silver knife, but it's still a good weapon for at least your black wizard, if not some of your other characters, and then you can hand it down later on. Next up, we've got weapons that you can get in different orders based on the dungeons you do, but I'll just say if you go to the waterfall first, because it's the shortest dungeon, you can pick up the wizard staff. I'm going to put it down here in the D tier. It's not very good. It's the second strongest weapon your black wizard can use, behind the cat claw. You can use it in combat to cast the amazing Confuse spell, which you probably shouldn't waste your time doing. Theoretically, you could use it on Carrie to confuse her, but generally it's not as useful as just casting fast on like a fighter than just taking her out in a few swings. So yeah. Next up, we've got the defense sword. This baby is definitely S tier. This thing is amazing. By the time you pick up the defense sword, it's going to be your strongest weapon for your knights, your red wizards, your ninjas. And it's also useful for other classes too, because they can use it as an item to cast the ruse spell. It's just a godly weapon that as soon as you pick it up, it'll be useful till the end of the game. Even if for some reason you're not using it as a weapon, you can use it as an item. It's good. Next up, we've got the Sea Shrine weapons. So we've got the Mage Staff. Definitely going into A tier. It can cast Fire 2 when you use it as an item, which can be great for saving your spell slots. You can use it as a weapon, technically, as a black mage, black wizard. It's not that powerful, but being able to use it as an item in combat, casting Fire 2, spamming it every fight, that's what makes it worthwhile. Next up, we've got the Light Axe. I'm going to put this thing in the B tier. It's not quite as good as the Mage Staff and Heal Staff. You can use it as an item to cast Harm 2, which isn't as useful as Fire 2 or the Heal spell, but you can also use it as a weapon. The Light Axe should never be your strongest weapon at any point in the game, unless you're going into the late game without class changing. Then it could theoretically be your best weapon for your fighter for a very short period of time, because a regular fighter can use it. You don't even have to class change into the knight. But for the most part, it's always going to be one of like your weaker melee weapons for your team. But it still has strong attack power with a good critical hit rate. So even if you have to like throw it on your ninja for a little while, it's still good. Next up, we've got, oh, I guess I forgot about this weapon. I forgot it existed. Our first Mirage Tower weapon. We've got the Vorpal Sword. Sorry, Vorpal lovers, this thing is straight up useless. By the time you get it, it shouldn't even be your fourth best weapon on any character, no matter what character class lineup you have. You should have 4 other weapons that are better than this thing. You get it incredibly late. It's only usable by class changed characters, the knight, the ninja, and the red wizard. Its heightened critical hit rate doesn't work on the NES. It still has a high critical hit rate, but not as impressive as other weapons around. You should just never use it. You could vendor it, but at this point in the game, the money isn't even a huge deal. Next up, we've got the Thor Hammer. Definitely an A tier weapon. It casts Lit 2 when used in combat, and it's your white wizard's strongest melee weapon. You could technically also wield it on the knight, but it wouldn't, or ninja, but it wouldn't be that powerful for them. But it is helpful for the white wizard to deal a little bit of melee damage. Then we've got a weapon that some people think is godly, but I tend to disagree. The Sun Sword. It has the 4th highest attack power in the game, but its critical hit rate is really poor. The best thing about it is it's usable by the fighter and red mage before they class change. So if you're doing like a weird challenge run where you don't class change, that can be their strongest weapon, which is neat. But for your class changed characters, it's generally not your strongest weapon. It's weaker than the defense sword for the most part because the defense sword has amazing critical hit rate and has more accuracy. For the 2 loss in power, it's definitely worthwhile. You want to be critting like twice as often. It's worth it. But Sun Sword is still a good weapon to pick up. Even at the end of the game, it's like your 4th best weapon. So it's not bad by any means. It's still usable in like almost every party situation. Then we've got the Bane Sword. I'll be putting this thing into the B tier. It casts Bane when it's used in combat as an item. You don't want to use this thing as a weapon because it's garbage. It's in Vorpal Sword territory for using it as a weapon by the time you get it, except it's worse because you have to get it in Sky Castle, not even Mirage Tower. But it casts Bane when used in combat, which you can use to instantly kill lots of regular enemies and certain bosses, which makes it useful, but not as useful as like Thor Hammer, Mage Staff, Heal Staff that you can just use like in every fight all the time. Then here, I'm putting the katana. I'll put it into the A tier, I guess. I should put it into B tier because it's not great. But it's technically the ninja's best weapon. It has 3 more attack power than the defense sword, 1 more attack power than the sun sword, and higher critical hit ratio than both. So it's not bad. It's just that it's only usable by the ninja, which isn't the strongest character class. Then, after you've cleared Sky Castle, you finally get access to Excalibur. This thing is a beast. The fighter's best weapon, or not the fighter, sorry, the knight's best weapon. It is leagues above all the other weapons that you have access to so far in the game. It is perfectly capable of murdering down chaos. Even without a Masamune, Excalibur can do some work. It'll be great for getting you through the entire final dungeon, and it's not to be slept on. It's a great weapon. Then, of course, we've got the Masamune going into the S tier. You technically only get access to the Masamune at the end of the game. You only use it for 2 final encounters. You could theoretically get to it, exit out of the dungeon, rest up, and be able to use it to run back through the final dungeon or continue farming experience, whatever you'd like. Everybody can use the Masamune. It is an insanely powerful weapon. It has the highest attack power, highest accuracy. Everyone can use it if their class changed or not. Even for the black belt, it is a useful weapon for them to use to deal even more damage, assuming they're under level 30. So next up, you guys may have noticed that the right side of the screen has got different random levels on it. Well, I decided to make a quick little list of what you can expect to be your 1st through 4th best weapons for a character class at different stages of the game. So fighters, as I was saying earlier, start with rapiers. Then by the time you get to Provoka, you can use hand axes, short swords at the lower levels. You guys probably stared at the fighter for long enough, so I will then go over to the knight, and you guys can see the knight's weapons. They can use a little bit better weapons. As you can see, I actually have the cat claw on here as a potential best weapon for them, assuming you class change and you get the airship before you have access to the defense sword. That cat claw could theoretically be one of your strongest weapons. Now let's move over to the thief class. I'll go over these a little bit quicker compared to all of the different weapons because, well, I already talked about a lot of the weapons for quite a while. Alright, Thief's up next. The Thief, as we see here, Rapier to Scimitar, the Saber, to Rune Sword, the Coral Sword, to Cry. Coral Sword for a long time. But if you class change into Ninja, the Ninja can actually use like the weapons that the Red Mage and the Knight uses, and actually gets access to the Cat Claw, the Ice Sword, Flame Sword, Light Axe, Defense Sword, Sun Sword, all that stuff. Katana. Next class should be a little easier. We've got, oops, I went too far, the Black Belt. The Black Belt is, yeah, not much to say about the Black Belt. You use a weapon for a very short period of time, then you just punch everything. If you get the Masamune early enough on, it can theoretically be that your Black Belt's strongest weapon, but you'll probably give it to somebody else that needs to upgrade more, and Black Master is pretty much the same thing. The Masamune can be useful when you get it. By the time you hit 30, time to take that thing off and your Black Belt's just punching things. Next up, we've got the Red Mage. Red Mage's weapons look very similar to the fighters, minus the axes. And same thing when we go to Red Wizard, pretty much the same thing like the fighters or the knights, minus the axes and Excalibur. Then we've got the White Mage. The White Mage here doesn't have a lot of weapons. You use the Iron Hammer till you beat Astos. Then you can use the Power Staff, which has less accuracy but more attack power, more critical hit ratio. Not more attack power. Tied attack power to the Silver Hammer, but has way more critical hit rate. So if you don't need to sell it for money, or if you don't really care about your White Mage critting things, you can sell the Power Staff and just use the Silver Hammer, that's fine. And as a White Mage, you don't get any upgrades after that until the Masamune. But if you become a White Wizard, at least you get the Thor Hammer. And that's about it. And then we've got the Black Mage last up. The Black Mage has a few more weapon options than the White Mage. He gets the knives. Then, again, you can give him the Power Staff over the Silver Knife for a short period of time if you want. But I think it's less useful for the Black Mage, because at level 13, the Black Mage gets 2 swings with the Silver Knife, which generally makes that better than the Power Staff. Then at 18, you can even use the Mage Staff over the Silver Knife to have 2 swings with that and have a heightened critical hit rate, more attack power. And when you class change the Black Mage to the Black Wizard, you get access to the Cat Claw, which is just great for him. The Wizard Staff is fine if you can't afford the Cat Claw, because you know there's plenty of other things to buy. And that's it for the tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed. I know it was a little long, but if you guys like this one as well, I can possibly try and do some more in the future. Thanks for watching.